jurors and the 2 remaining alternates have returned to the courtroom. Juror 145 was excused, ladies and gentlemen, due to her becoming ill. So we excused her because she was ill. Defendant is present with counsel as our counsel for the state of Ohio. We're continuing with the presentation of the defense mitigation. Mr. Whitney, you may call your next witness.
Dr. John Fabian, Your Honor. Sir, do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, nothing but the truth?
I swear. Good morning.
Morning, Doctor. Dr. Fabian, could you state your name for the record, please?
John Matthew Fabian.
And, Doc, what do you do for a living?
I'm a practice as a forensic psychologist and a neuropsychologist.
You might want to pull that microphone over a little bit there.
Sure.
There you go. Now, you practice as a psychologist, but more specifically as a clinical and forensic psychologist?
That's correct.
And you practice as a forensic neuropsychologist?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what those specialties are and the differences?
Sure. So psychologists essentially evaluate, assess, and treat human behavior. So we look at a lot of different psychological and psychiatric disorders that individuals have, such as depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, different disorders I'm sure you've all heard. So we also conduct psychological testing to help us understand those types of disorders. We diagnose mental illnesses, we treat mental illnesses as well, primarily through different types of individual and group therapies. So neuropsychology is really the practice of assessing more brain behavior functioning. So not only mental illness, but also other brain-based disorders such as dementia, stroke, seizure, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, let's say. So different disorders of the brain. And we're specially trained to learn how to conduct those different types of tests. And so when we look at the word forensic, that means basically a legal forum of me evaluating different legal issues as a psychologist and neuropsychologist. So that really makes the fields of forensic psychology and forensic neuropsychology. So there's different legal questions, such as one's competency to stand trial or insanity, or in this case, mitigating factors that a jury may consider and give weight to when they're really making a decision on what to do with Shawn Grate at his sentencing trial.
Are you board certified in any special areas?
Yeah, I'm board certified by the American Board of Professional Psychology and Clinical Psychology and Forensic Psychology.
Now, doctor, to your knowledge in the United States, what's the percentage of psychologists nationally who are board certified in any one of the specialty areas of psychology?
About 3%.
Do you know the percentage of psychologists in the country who are board certified in 2 areas?
That's like less than 0.5%.
Can you explain your training as a clinical neuropsychologist?
Yeah, I started out as a forensic psychologist initially. You want me to go through that training first, or?
Sure.
So basically, I had learned mental illness through Cook County Jail and the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Chicago. And I learned what mental illness was, or is, and how to assess it, how to administer IQ tests or intelligence tests, or administer different types of personality or mental illness type instruments. And did therapy with federal inmates there as well. And then I worked then as a resident intern through the Medical College of Ohio, and they have a court psychiatric clinic that covers the west part of the state. So I worked in that facility doing more forensic evaluations of competency. Courts and lawyers would request different types of examinations that they would want. Sex offender risk assessment, psychological factors in the crime, different types of evaluations for both pre-trial and pre-sentence purposes. Then I worked at about 4 of them in the state, 3 adult facilities, court psychiatric facilities, and 1 juvenile. And then I worked at a maximum security facility in the state of Minnesota doing the same type of cases on the legal unit, and they were working with not only these pretrial evaluations, but mentally ill, dangerous, and sexually dangerous persons populations. Whether the folks should be evaluated and kept in the hospital or be sent into the community, let's say. Then I became more interested in doing neuropsychology, and as far as your question about clinical neuropsychology, I examined both juveniles and adults. So the Applewood Psychiatric Centers in Cleveland, Ohio is a facility for high-risk youth and their families, and I would evaluate the children primarily for neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, low intelligence, intellectual disability, formerly called mental retardation, epilepsy in childhood, brain injury, and learning disabilities. I also had worked at a neurology and neuroscience facility in Akron as a consultant where I was examining adult clinical patients as to these neurological disorders that they may have in addition to mental illness. I did a 2-year fellowship in clinical neuropsychology at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, where I worked there with adolescents and mostly adults that had these types of brain-based either injuries or conditions, some adolescents with similar brain-based problems, and then VA veterans at the Albuquerque VA there, working on a polytrauma unit where a lot of these veterans had different types of trauma such as brain injury and post-traumatic stress or PTSD. So, that's basically my training, I would say, summarized.
Are you familiar with the term fellowship?
Yeah.
What is there a fellowship in one of the programs that you're?
Yeah, so I did a 2-year post-certification program in clinical neuropsychology, and then I did a 2-year fellowship in clinical neuropsychology, and that's just basically further training and specialization in an area. So in psychology, there's different areas: social psychology, developmental psychology, and then we have neuropsychology, let's say. So I am fellowship trained in clinical neuropsychology.
So you practice as a forensic psychologist and a forensic neuropsychologist?
I do.
Have you had any academic appointments?
Yes, I've had appointments at Cleveland State University in psychology of violence, forensic psychology and law, intellectual assessment as well at Case Western Reserve University, and I've done different didactics and trainings at University of Texas School of Medicine and the University of Texas Health Sciences Center, San Antonio, 2 medical schools down there.
What would be your academic history and degrees that are conferred upon?
Sure. So I have a bachelor's degree in political psychology, or political science and psychology from University of Cincinnati, and I have a master's degree in general psychology from UC. I have a clinical psychology master's and a clinical psychology doctorate degree from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. I have a Juris Doctorate JD Law degree from Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and then postdoctorate certification programming, and then a fellowship in clinical neuropsychology, as I said before, through University of New Mexico School of Medicine.
Any editorial boards in your field?
Yeah, I've been on different editorial boards in my field where we basically look at different articles that are in fields that I practice in, and we'll review to see if this journal article, pass muster to be published or needs revision or should be rejected. Journal of Aggression and Violent Behavior, Journal of Forensic Psychology Practice, Psychological Injury in Law, Forensic Psychology Unbound, International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology. I'm on the boards of those journals.
Your Honor,
Yes,
can the state see what the witness is reading from?
It's my CV.
absolutely. You're entitled to see what that is.
Counsel, can we see what your witness said?
Sure, go ahead.
Is this the only copy?
No, I got an extra copy, I think.
You have this one?
Yeah.
You may continue, Mr. Whitney.
So you've been published in peer-reviewed journals?
I have.
What are some of your publications then?
So I'm published in different peer-reviewed journals. One is actually a book chapter that's been published, Forensic Neuropsychology and Violence, Neuroscientific and Legal Implications. That book is a Handbook of Forensic Neuroscience. Assessing the Sex Offender with Asperger's Disorder, a Forensic Psychological and Neuropsychological Perspective. Applying Roper versus Simmons in Juvenile Transfer and Waiver Proceedings. That was in the International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology. So there's just been some different publications I've had over the years that are, in the fields I practice in.
Could you provide us with some of your work experience relative to clinical psychology and forensic psychology?
Sure. So after, I was at the Medical College of Ohio in the court psychiatric, the Diagnostic and Treatment Center. I then worked as a court psychologist in Lake County and then in the Youngstown, eastern part of the state area, Forensic Psychiatric Center of Northeast Ohio. I worked on and off for about 13 years at the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Court Diagnostic Clinic, working with juveniles. I worked, as I said, in the legal forensic unit of Minnesota Security Hospital. And then I work both I work in different states doing forensic examinations, work for the courts in Austin, Travis County, Texas, performing competency and stand trial evaluations.
Now you indicated you have a law degree, correct?
I do.
Do you practice law?
No, I don't.
Okay. Have you written law review articles?
Yeah, I've written articles, yeah.
What would those articles be about? Do you recall?
I've written articles on intellectual disability and the death penalty. I've written articles on sexually violent predator, civil commitment evaluations in law in one or two law review journals as well.
Now, in some of the articles you've written, and I've seen some, they're somewhat instructive. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've written a couple articles that have, instructive information about how to examine different legal cases.
And they're instructive for attorneys, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Like how to proceed with investigating mitigation or evaluating it, such as in this case.
Have you participated in lectures to like legal associations or medical associations?
I have, yeah. I did a couple times this week, in fact.
What kind of psychological evaluations for courts do you normally conduct?
So basically, as I said before, pre-trial evaluations, we really look at competency to stand trial or waive Miranda rights, and not guilty by reason of insanity or mental state at the time of the offense evaluations. Those would be more before trial. And then I evaluate examinations for after trial for sentencing, such as this, or even post-conviction after an individual is, let's say, convicted of their offense. Those would be primarily the examinations I do.
So as far as a court psychologist or a court-appointed psychologist or expert witness, about, do you have a rough idea as to how many clients you would have examined?
I would say 3,500 plus. It's less than 4,000, but somewhere around there.
Have a great deal of those been as a court psychologist for the government?
Yes.
Have you been recognized as an expert in prior legal proceedings?
Yes.
Do you know about how many times that's happened?
Well, appointed thousands, testified no more than 300.
in various different courts?
Yeah, different states, counties, yeah.
Different states and different levels of courts?
Yeah, I've been involved with probably 30, 35 states for evaluations, yeah.
What kind of evaluations have you testified in court about?
The competencies, as I mentioned, sanity, not guilty by reason of insanity, death penalty mitigation, intellectual disability hearings in capital cases, juvenile transfer, juvenile homicide cases, sex offending risk assessment, parental fitness evaluations, child custody, police fitness for duty evaluations.
Can you indicate some of the states that you testified in?
Yeah, I would say Illinois, Indiana, Texas, Florida, Idaho, Ohio, California, Alabama, Missouri, New York. Those are some states.
And you're here today testifying.
Sure.
You working for free?
No, I'm not.
You're not?
No.
What's your hourly rate usually?
300 per hour.
And is this commensurate for an expert in your field with your training experience?
It's around that, probably a little low.
Approximately how many adult offenders have you examined in your career?
Close to 3,000.
3,000?
Yeah. Well, close to, there's been civil cases in there, child custody, but most of that would include those offenders.
Specifically with individuals charged with murder, about how many of those have you evaluated?
400 plus, no, less than 500.
Have you evaluated cases that are both capital cases and not capital cases?
That's true, yes.
Do you have any idea what kind of numbers those would be?
50-50, probably a little bit more non-capital offenders.
Now, how are cases referred to you?
Usually, defense lawyers want to know what is going on with their client, their defendant they're representing in serious cases. So that's typically, the source of referral. I've been referred cases by courts and some by prosecutors. Mostly it's been by defense attorneys. They want a thorough workup, and so that's what I do.
So if Mr. Tennell had asked you in some case to perform a rebuttal examination or to testify in rebuttal, you're open to doing that too?
Absolutely, yes.
Not that he wants to. What is your job repayment dependent on the outcome of a particular case?
No, I don't get invested in the outcome as far as what you all decide to do. I'm here to follow the law of evaluating mitigation in this case. And so that's what I did. And you all have to decide what you think are aggravating and mitigating factors in your decision here.
Have you had occasion to tell attorneys something they don't want to hear?
Every week.
Pardon?
Every week.
Every week?
Yes.
Now, does that hurt your practice any?
It has in the past. Yeah, it has in the past, but I mean, I try to be objective and thorough about these cases, and so be it.
Now, have you examined individuals for competency to stand trial?
Yeah.
Have you examined individuals for competency to waive rights?
Yes.
Have you examined individuals for competency to waive appeal rights on death row?
Yes.
Okay. And have you made determinations as to whether somebody was, or provided testimony as to whether somebody was competent to be executed?
Yes, I had a case in Texas several months ago. I recommended that the individual was competent to waive appeals and move forward to execution, yes.
Can we assume today that any opinions that you might be offering here today would be offered with a reasonable degree of psychological and neurological certainty?
A neuropsychological certainty, yes.
Okay. Now, as Mr. Grate's concerned, Shawn Grate's concerned, I am his attorney, correct?
You are, yeah.
Okay. So I would be his advocate, correct?
That's correct.
Are you his advocate?
Absolutely not.
Are you here to justify or excuse what he has done as far as his offenses go?
No.
All right. How did you first become a consultant in this case?
You had contacted me to examine Shawn and had questions as to legal sanity, such as a not guilty by reason of insanity defense and capital mitigation.
Okay, what essentially is mitigation to you in your field?
Well, it's basically following the law. The U.S. Supreme Court has mandated mitigation investigations, as has your American Bar Association. So there's two phases of this trial, as you're aware, and one is guilt innocence and one is sentencing. And my understanding of the law is that there needs to be a balance where the background history of the defendant, information about his history, crimes, legal history, mental health history, everything about him needs to be thrown in your lap for you to really digest or analyze and conceptualize, think about as to whether you think there's mitigating to, a lessening effect of penalty from death to life without parole. That's also, really looking at, I guess, moral culpability, they say, is whether, this is worthy of the ultimate punishment. So I'm here to provide more information about Shawn Grate, his life, my evaluation of him. So, that's, I guess, my answer.
Have you written articles about mitigation in the past?
Yeah, I've written some articles, yeah.
Have you written articles in both law review articles and in psychiatric articles?
Yeah.
How in your past has your role in mitigation been investigated? In any particular case that you would have?
How do I do the investigation?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we have a mitigation specialist. In this case, his name is James Crates, and he will investigate, actually have Shawn sign releases to get information about his life, attempt to interview family members or collateral folks that knew or know Shawn, and then I use that information. I looked at different records. There's a lot of records in this case, as you can imagine. So I will look at any discovery in this case. Police reports, I know you heard Ms. Mager testify, so I read her 80-page, discovery or evidence police investigation of what, she found was relevant in these cases. I also, evaluated Shawn on 4 occasions and did or conducted a number of psychological and neuropsychological tests with him. Did a lot of interviewing. I prepared a report that I do have up here that the attorneys have as to capital mitigation. So it's doing investigation, evaluation as to his background history, my assessment of him. I did talk to some family members by telephone. Many experts in my shoes do not do that. I try to do that in cases. And I interviewed them about his life, their relationship with him. You just had heard from his sister Barb, so I had talked with her as well.
When you obtain this information or obtain the information that Mr. Crates provides to you, do you put a biased slant on this on your investigation?
I mean, mitigation is, I'd say, biased. I mean, mitigation is really considered as to lessen or reduce penalty from death to life without parole. So I think it's a biased investigation. I'm not here to, I wasn't asked to provide aggravating evidence for the states or prosecution. So, you know, I'm not here to, you know, mislead the jury in any way. I'm here to present potential mitigating factors that are relevant in this case.
Is it important for defense counsel to investigate mitigating factors?
You'll be an effective assistance of counsel if you don't. I mean, by law, you need to. Certainly, it's part of your representation. So you have different folks that assist you in that. Certainly.
Is it your job to investigate aggravating factors?
No, it's not my job. And I mean, the prosecution may cross-examine me about those issues, and I'll try to, you know, respond.
Now, you understand the judge instructs what mitigating factors and aggravating factors are, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any concerns about mitigation with regard to Shawn in this case?
He can answer this question, yes or no. Overruled.
Yes.
Okay. What would your concerns be?
Counsel approach. Dr. Fabian, are you aware of neuroimaging data that was done in this case?
Yes.
And have the findings of the neuroimaging data been discussed with you?
The initial findings of, I'd say, half of the imaging, yes, but the rest of the imaging, no.
Why did that not happen?
Sustained.
About how many occasions or how many hours total did you spend with Shawn Grate?
I met with Shawn March 4th, 2017, July 23rd, 2017, November 2nd, 2017, and March 21st, 2018. As far as hours, I was in that jail probably 25 hours. I don't have an exact amount, but quite a bit of time with him.
Now that's just time in particular with Shawn, is that correct?
Or, you know, I was at the jail a long time, waiting for Shawn, getting to see Shawn, having dinner breaks for Shawn, things like that.
Well, what I mean is you spent other hours speaking to other people as well.
Well, that's in addition to that, yeah.
Right. What kind of records did you review when doing the mitigation report for Shawn?
Sure. So there was basically Ohio Department of Corrections records. Shawn had been in prison before. Different hospital records, mental health records, police report records. So those would be primarily most of the records I had reviewed. I had reviewed some information, on the internet as far as media reports, different letters he had written, so different statements he'd made. So that would be most of the information.
Did you prepare a report for your mitigation?
I did, yes.
Okay. About how long is it?
81 pages.
Now, is that longer than normal?
Yeah.
And what would you attribute that to?
It's a complex case. It's, a very, unfortunate and, horrible circumstance of his offenses. And there's a lot of information that I included from his police reports and his statements to me, and then just the different testing, that I did with him. And then I did an opinion section that, was lengthy, talking about just different themes in his case, his life, his family's life, issues that I had concerns about that were potentially mitigating. So this analysis section was quite long, so it was a pretty long report.
Now, before we would review items contained in your report, what would your thoughts be as to potential mitigating factors in this case?
So, in brief, there's a multi-generational mitigation foundation as far as Shawn's family and especially his mother's life and what I think are her mitigating circumstances relevant to abuse, sexual abuse, trauma, broken family, his problems with attachment similar to hers in childhood, his attachment disorder between himself and his parents, his early neurodevelopmental brain disorder conditions, especially of ADHD and learning disability, and childhood, at least concussion experiences, his psychiatric symptoms and conditions relevant to long-term depression, potentially bipolar disorder, complex trauma, and a probable mild neurocognitive disorder. My testing showed some significant, at least mild neuropsychological deficits, especially in these language disability, executive functioning, and memory areas that I'll go through. And then just a disdain towards his mother that I think is interwoven in some of these offenses.
When you use the term mild disorder, that's a psychiatric term, is that correct?
Yes.
When you say mild, you don't mean, well, it's not so bad.
No, it's certainly more impaired than an average person, but not severe where he cannot take care of himself and, is basically illiterate or has no memory or demented, let's say.
So a disorder can still exist even though it has a term attached to it as mild?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Also, why do you spend so much time looking at the upbringing of the parents of an individual?
Well, these defendants are not born in a bubble where they pop out and, they move on with their life. I mean, their parents are certainly affected by their own lives. And, how you're raised certainly has a connection to how the parent, was raised and how they grew up. It's cyclical, certainly, good or bad.
Is it possible to break that cycle?
That's difficult. It's not impossible.
Now, you've met with Barb Charter, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Would she be somebody that has broke that cycle?
Yeah, we're breaking. Sure, it's probably a lifetime ordeal or process. She, on her cover, looks very healthy, secure, and motivated and successful. I know she has shared with me a lot of her skeletons, but she's been a productive citizen, certainly.
Let's go ahead and go through your report then. When considering Shawn's background, Shawn's history, what did you find as far as instability in family life? Or did you find any?
Judge, can we ask for a motion to certify this person to testify as an expert so we can offer opinions for the record? Does counsel plan on making a motion?
We can, Judge. I move that the court hold Dr. Fabian as an expert in the field that he testifies to.
Objection.
Okay. Dr. Fabian is recognized as an expert in the areas to which he's testified about forensic
Thank you.
psychology.
Same question.
Yeah, it's a quite tumultuous, chaotic family life, dysfunctional. I would say that I got a little confused on when he was raised by who. When I get confused, I've done enough to these to say that it was chaotic, okay? So, you know, his mother, I think, got married at 14 to his father at age 21, which is, I believe, now illegal in Kentucky, but it was legal then in the 70s. And, you know, she escaped a lot of her own abuse, got married at a young age, got pregnant at a young age. And he then went and lived off and on with both parents, Teresa and Terry. And, you know, his father eventually was having an affair, I think brought his girlfriend into the hospital while she was giving birth. I had heard that. And so there's a lot of friction between parents. And then he went to live with, you know, his mother and father initially, I believe, and then his mother, and then his father, and then by himself around age 16 across the street from his father. And, you know, his mother was in and out of his life at different times. I don't know if you want me to sequence through these time periods.
Did you find that, or how long for a period did you find that Shawn lived with his mother after the initial divorce?
Yeah, I would say that there was probably a 9-year period, and then she got married and poof, was gone one day to Kentucky. Didn't want him to be a sissy or mama's boy, so he then lived with his father and his brother, and they were together for a few years. I know Shawn started getting into trouble, and then his mother had legal custody and moved back to the area, and then Shawn reunited with her for a period.
So Shawn ended up moving, you found that Shawn ended up moving back with his mother at one point?
Yes, I think she had kicked him and his brother out at least one different point. And it was really just kind of a chaotic, unstable childhood, in my opinion.
Are you aware of his mother's occupations during this period of time?
Yeah, I was aware she had bartended. She was a go-go dancer. I don't know how far that goes into stripping, but she was in that line of work.
Do you find that as being common in sexual homicide cases?
Objection.
Counsel approach.
Yeah.
Can you describe your experience?
Out of the, I don't know, 480 and change murder cases, I've probably seen 1 out of 100 murder cases in North America, Canada, and U.S. are sexually motivated. I've probably seen about 20 sexual homicide-related cases.
And have you found factors that are consistent in the cases that you looked at?
Some, yeah.
Do some of those factors exist in this case?
Yes.
What is the importance of multi-generational evaluation?
So I look at parents and how they're raised primarily, because they raise the offspring defendant, and often, usually, they have their own traumatic experiences childhood, their own psychological, emotional issues with their parents and how they were raised. Often have their own mental illness, addictions, trust relations. So it's important to get at that information.
What, have you found on occasion that Shawn was with his mother and occasionally Shawn was not with his mother?
Yes.
Is that important to your evaluation?
Yes.
Why so?
It's really how a child attaches to their parents and ideally parents. And we often see in these cases they don't. It's a damaged, disorganized type of attachment where they don't connect or bond with the primary caregiver consistently, adequately, with fortitude, strength, purpose. So that will certainly affect how this youth navigates his world and how he develops interpersonally, specifically. It also would be related to what we call developmental psychopathology or maladaptive behaviors inside or outside. Suicide inside, outside, acting out behaviors. Really how they can connect with other people throughout their life, developmentally. And if it's damaged or, let's just say, not good when they're a youth, then this is going to have an impact on them down the road as they progress through life.
Were you able to speak to Shawn about his relationship with his mother?
In quite a while, yes.
What information did you gain from speaking to Shawn?
Well, at some point, I think he called her crazy and mentally ill. He said that there was a lacking of consistency with her. He did acknowledge her vocation. Also, bringing, men in the home and wanting to find that guy that was going to be, let's say, taken to help take care of her. At one point at age 4, he reported early fantasies of wanting to kill his mother. Maybe another age 5, he was always afraid of his mother. And there's a word that keeps sticking in my head in this case, and it's called misery or miserable. And so he always called his mother miserable. And she lived a life of misery and wanted to take her out of that misery. Even developmentally as a kid, he had fantasies and thoughts of doing that. So there seemed to be a love and hate split toward his mother, desire to want to be with her, but also a rejection and a hatred towards her. So that would be, I guess, a focal point, at least my evaluation of him, and maybe some explanation as to these offenses.
Did the information that you obtained from Shawn, was that corroborated, was that consistent with the information you came from other people?
I would say so, especially folks that I had talked to, aunts or cousins or sisters, about the mother just being mean, cold.
Well, that's where living instructional hearsay with respect to people other than the defendant.
That's what approach. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to advise you that statements made to Dr. Fabian by other individuals are hearsay. They are not evidence in this case. They may be used by Dr. Fabian for the purpose of forming his opinions, but you don't need to, well, I'll just leave it at that. If there's a hearsay statement made and it's just repeated to you, it is not evidence. You should not consider it. You should disregard it. You can weigh that to the extent it's used to support the source of any opinion or expert opinion he would render in this matter. You may continue, Mr. Whitney.
Dr. Fabian, let's back up to the different diagnoses that you've had. You describe one of them to us.
he has a persistent depressive disorder.
Let's do that. What information did you use to form an opinion as to your diagnosis of that disorder?
His self-reported symptoms during jail and pre-jail historically, his sister's statements, also his psychological testing.
But what specific information did you use to form your opinion?
Beyond that information?
Including
As far as my opinions in this report,
yes.
my interviews with family members, the discovery evidence I had, his self-report, the testing I conducted for the most part.
What information did you get from interviewing other people? What information did you use?
Their observations of Shawn developmentally, historically, facts about his life, where he lived, their perceptions of Shawn and his family members.
Okay, well, what were you informed?
Was I informed?
What were you told from these people? To support your opinion?
About all of his diagnoses?
Let's just start with one. Yeah.
Do you want to go through all his diagnoses now?
Sure.
Well, I will say most of my evaluation and diagnoses were based on my own evaluation of him. Most of the information from the family really was more about family dynamics and how they perceived different individuals and relationships. One moment. All right, so his diagnoses include persistent depressive disorder, which is a long-term mild depressive condition. An unspecified bipolar and related disorder.
Now, can you describe that in language that I can understand? I'm going to guess everybody else in here understands that, except me.
Well, I will explain that. He has an other specified trauma and stressor-related disorder, so evidence of complex trauma, a learning disorder.
Let's take them one at a time.
Okay, each one. So he's been depressed. I would not say major depression. I would say a persistent mild depressive disorder, developmental, low self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy, kind of hopeless, helpless guy. Not overly suicidal or major depressed where he can't move or function. A lot of it has to do more with the cognitive feature of depression and how one views themselves. Very inadequate, low self-esteem. I have unspecified bipolar and related.
Let's stick with depression. What information then was provided to you that helped support your opinion of the depressive disorder?
Well, I would say there were statements by his mother and sister about his inadequacy. He was on the short bus. He had a learning disability, and learning disabilities often lead to kids really having low self-esteem. He hated that bus, okay? So my recollection was that I learned from the family that he had low self-esteem as a youth and was kind of a depressed kid, right? And there was a connection between that depression and the neurodevelopmental disorders of ADHD and learning disability and the short bus, okay?
What's your next diagnosis? Bipolar?
Yeah, unspecified bipolar and related disorders. So,
Yeah, describe what that is.
sure. Did you want to go through testing later, or just?
No, we do that now, because that's going to support your opinion, correct?
Sure, okay. So on some testing here for back to the depression, we have some clinical scales of depression that I administered, Shawn. And let's say the Beck Depression Inventory is one of them. And he admitted to me, and self-reported, significant features of depression. Now, when I evaluated him, he was more in a severe form of depression, and heck, he's a mild depressed guy by history, and then we have these cases, and now we have his legal situation, and we have some serious consequences. He was more in the severe depression range, but I'm not looking at that as Shawn historically, okay? And one thing I think the jury needs to know is that I'm seeing him now, not a month before all this happened, and not 1984. So I have to try to make meaning of what I think, how he functioned, historically. I would say mild depression by history and more severe depression now. So when we look at, his psychological testing, I'm seeing, pretty consistent depression. Now, we have basically a unspecified bipolar related disorder. I had some concerns in this case about whether he had a bipolar disorder, and you've probably heard manic depression in the past, the highs and lows.
Can you describe what that is first?
Sure. So it's a mood disorder, and some people have really highs, the mania, or hypomania, which is a little bit less severe than mania, and then the lows of depression, okay? And the highs of mania can be, impulsivity, they're up for days at a time, they're talking fast, they're racing talks, they're writing disorganized fashion, everything's fast, accelerated. They're having problems with, doing too many things, they're disorganized in what they're doing and saying, and they're maybe hypersexual. They may call people in the middle of the night. Okay, so I didn't really see that with him, but he endorsed it on a mood disorder questionnaire that got into the specific symptoms of mania.
And when you say endorsed it, you don't mean that Shawn filled out papers and said, hey, I got this.
Well, no, he, in interview and then on a mood disorder questionnaire with pencil, he did endorse it, yes.
But by endorsing it, you mean that's how the results...
Oh, yeah, no, he didn't say, I was trying to sell a diagnosis. No, he was, he endorsed it based on paperwork. He filled out a form that showed me that he was reporting symptoms of bipolar and mania, okay? So I don't think he has full-blown mania. I think he has, we call like hypomania, perhaps, but this case gets complicated because he had a history of ADHD, okay, which is another diagnosis that I did render in this case. So that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That disorder really is a neurodevelopmental disorder, a brain development disorder, more affecting your frontal lobe of your brain, your ability to attend, your ability to problem solve, your ability to think through consequences, your impulse control, okay? So your mental flexibility, and some of his neuropsychological testing I think would be consistent with an ADHD history. He was not as much of an endorser or a symptom reporter of ADHD developmentally, though. I think his sister and mother had talked a lot about ADHD in symptoms, such as, his abilities to, his inability to keep strong, sustained attention, okay, to stay focused, he's very impulsive, think about consequences, but even as a kid, because this disorder, neurodevelopmental disorder of ADHD is really a diagnosis we see beginning in childhood through adulthood. Not everyone consistently has ADHD in adulthood, but about half the folks that had it as a kid do continue having it. So, in this kind of case, he had some mild functional deficits with ADHD, reported some symptoms. His mother and sister certainly diagnosed, or not diagnosed, but provided a lot of symptoms for him as a child and adolescent.
What other disorder do you have then?
So I also have what I'd say is other specified trauma and stressor-related disorder. I don't believe he did not fully endorse PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He, I think, endorsed some symptoms of it. So the testing did not come out where I felt comfortable diagnosing with PTSD. But in my opinion, there was evidence of what we call complex trauma, which is significant trauma that has a foundation interpersonally, especially between child and parent, and where there's either abuse or neglect. And there is more, I think, neglect and emotional detachment in this case than abuse of Shawn physically or sexually. There's more of like an emotional neglect as being a foundation of early trauma than abuse.
What information did you use to support that opinion?
That was more, his self-report of just, some dissociative type episodes, detachment from other people. At times, I guess a lack of happiness or bonding with others, having love and connected feelings with other people. I know there was a lot of then trauma and I'd say destruction in his relationships with women he's had. So I think that carries over from, his early lack of connection, with his mother.
Let's talk about that what you found there and his relationship with women. What's exactly the effect there?
Well, I think the jury knows a lot about the facts of this case with some of these women he had relationships with. And he also had dating relationships with other women, and they seemed to me to be all dysfunctional. Some of them had domestic violence, they were destructive in nature. I think...
Yes, you may.
I'm sorry, Doctor, where were you?
Well, just describing his history of destructive relationships with women. I know that there was a medical record where he had gone to the hospital and had been stabbed with a knife by one of his partners, a woman he was involved with, and there was just domestic violence, riddled within these relationships. The nature of instant offenses obviously are violent, and it's my opinion that he certainly had difficulties with intimacy, obviously, and there was more aggression, rage, dysfunction within the relationships with women, and a lack of intimacy or ability to form, proper, physical, sexual, emotional attachments with women.
Let's see if we can go to specifics involving the two deaths that we had here. Take, for instance, Elizabeth Griffith. You might have to refer your notes to which one's which. Elizabeth Griffith would have been the girl that came over to his house that there is no allegation of having sex with.
No.
Supposedly he made comments to detectives about when to put this girl out of her misery. Yes. Can you describe what your findings have been, what your opinions have been in relation to that particular offense?
Well, there was a miserable theme, as noted before in my testimony, about wanting to take his mother out of her own misery. And I think in some way, shape, or form, that theme has carried out into some of his offenses.
So is there any other disorder that applies in that case specifically?
Well, I don't know if you're asking me, how these disorders apply?
Yes.
I guess it would be best to describe all the disorders and then maybe get an opinion.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and keep on going to that, and then we'll go back on that then. What would your next disorder then
Sure.
be?
So I had a language-based learning disorder. Shawn had special education classes, and as noted, he was on a special bus, special school classes, and my understanding was that there was more language-based deficits as a youth that he had. And so a language learning disorder is basically another neurodevelopmental disorder regarding brain function and development and function, where it's flawed or compromised somehow. We usually don't know why someone has a neurodevelopmental disorder. And it affects how they communicate, perceive, and receive language, express themselves, understand, comprehend what other people are telling them, and really how we navigate our lives through language. And so, in my opinion, his learning and his language skills were certainly flawed. Now, when we look at, the reason for this, or how I came to that opinion, well, we have a history of special education, and then in special classes, the sister and mother had told me about their concerns relevant to both ADHD and his learning disorder. And then I conducted neuropsychological testing. So we got into his intelligence and IQ. Okay. So when we break this down, this gets a little bit complex for those who have not heard it, but we look at his academic achievement, reading, writing, spelling, and math, and he had some deficits in just overall reading, and that's either reading of single words, sentence comprehension, reading comprehension skills, or reading fluency. So he's slow in processing information and reading adequately. So across the board of reading words, processing the reading of simple sentences, and comprehending what he reads. He also had some spelling skill deficits, and my first take on this was that he was reading and functioning academically somewhere around 10 or 11 years of age. He just didn't have that good a skill set academically. Now, I think he obviously had achieved better in high school, but he was in special education classes. Now, he also had a full-scale IQ, so intelligence is really our ability, and it's broken down into 4 areas. And he had a full-scale IQ of 83, and that is in the below average to borderline range of intelligence. So 83 is around the 13th percentile. That means about every 100 people his same age that walk through the door, basically 87 will do better than him on this test. So when we break this down further, there's 4 areas to intelligence. One is verbal comprehension, and that was a score of 76. That's 5th percentile. So 95 folks out of 100 will do better, and that's really a major impairment in this case, and that's going to be related to his ability to have verbal abstract reasoning abilities, and basically his general fund of knowledge, his verbal comprehension skills. His perceptual reasoning, you have kind of left brain, we often think is language, right brain is perceptual spatial reasoning, was 100, so it was average. And when we see a 24-point split here, that's only really found in about 2 to 3% of the population. So we're starting to think, hey, this guy's got some severe, maybe left hemispheric language-based impairments going on. He's not good at verbal or language skills. Perceptual reasoning is his strength. But overall, those differentiations often point to a learning disability in language, okay? Then we have a third area of IQ, which is called working memory, okay? And that's going to be an area of active attention, some memory, also we call executive functioning, kind of manipulate information in mind. How do we store and utilize information we're learning or bring it back from memory? The other area is going to be processing, and that was an 80, and that's 9th percentile. Processing speed was an 89, 25th percentile, about average range. Now that area of processing without language, with just like numbers and symbols, was average, but when you throw language in there, he struggles, and that again highlights some verbal fluency deficits. So we're starting to see some brain-based cognitive neuropsychological impairments in this case that I do have concerns about. That information and his history would support a neurodevelopmental disorder in learning and in language.
Okay, what would your next disorder be then?
So borderline intellectual functioning is not really a disorder. It's just kind of a acknowledgement of what an IQ score is. Typically it's about 71 to 84. We're in this borderline range, but he's kind of at least a low average guy, but that's really not a diagnosis. The mild neurocognitive disorder due to traumatic brain injury, this one could be also considered as maybe an unspecified. He had some early childhood concussions. I don't have any data on this. I do know that he has some neuropsychological impairments that I have some concerns about. And those would be in areas of executive functioning, kind of how we reason and problem solve, basically the frontal lobe part of the brain. He had some deficiencies there. He had some deficiencies, again, with processing speed and impulsivity. So his testing on ability to kind of inhibit, control impulses was impaired. So with this executive functioning, I thought that there may be a evidence of a mild neurocognitive disorder due to effects of early childhood concussions. I'd like to have more information to really solidify that opinion. I will say, in my opinion, his brain's not working right. Basically, I think we have, like, an analogy is a car with 4 wheels. We've got about 3. We've got about 3-wheel car driving on the road. The next diagnosis, we had talked about, I think, ADHD. Then we have cannabis use disorder. On one of the psychological tests, the substance abuse subtle screening inventory, he acknowledged enough information to support a drug dependence. In my opinion, he had used and abused cannabis. He was smoking up to about 1/4 ounce per week, a lot less than many defendants I examined, but certainly a couple, maybe hours per day, and I think he used it to calm himself down. I think he used it to deal with his emotions, his depression, even maybe his energy, his highs, and just to deal with life in a maladaptive manner. And finally, I have what we call a personality disorder, and it's mixed and severe. So basically, a personality disorder is a condition, we say developmental, but we really don't diagnose it until about age 18. Our personalities are formed before that, and they're all ever developing around that time. And our diagnostic manual of mental disorders recognizes about 10 of them. And a personality disorder basically is kind of an enduring condition as to how we view ourselves, view the world, how we interact with others, we perceive self and others, how we behaviorally control or not control, how we really, cognitively think, and how we emotionally react. So kind of emotional, cognitive, behavioral functioning. With many personality disorders, or most or all, there's going to be dysfunction, so maladaptive coping skills. In this case, there was kind of an unusual conglomeration or pot of them, where I don't typically see these all together in a particular case. Now, he has characteristics of antisocial personality, which is going to be someone who has trouble following rules and regulations and the law. So these folks are going to be common in prison. They're going to be, impulsive, reckless, disregard for self and others. They're going to have a history of having criminal offenses. We also have borderline personality traits. These traits are with individuals who often have pretty severe attachment deficits in childhood, and they're going to, often be, victims of abuse or neglect in childhood, some traumatic experiences in childhood. They're going to have difficulties, bonding, connecting with others. They're going to look at people kind of borderline of I love this person, I hate this person. And we could see that in some of Shawn's behaviors, his relationships, where he fears abandonment, he's very inadequate, doesn't know how to connect with women, he's impulsive, reckless, and really has volatile relationships. And so there's a history here of that, certainly. And in my opinion, a foundation laid during his childhood to have some of those traits developed. Narcissistic personality features really have a sense of one's entitlement and maybe grandiosity, and a lack of really connection with how their behaviors affect others. Okay. The schizoid personality disorder traits and schizotypal personality traits are really when an individual lacks emotional connectedness with other people. They're detached from others, they don't have much emotional enjoyment in life. The schizotypal personality features are also represented by an individual who has bizarre thinking, not maybe delusional, but on their way to having false beliefs that are not based in reality contact. He had some really unusual, bizarre thinking with some of the letters he had written, the news, that were, a bit disorganized. Just bizarre mentation and thinking. And again, a lack of interconnectedness with other people, emotional intimacy with other people. So that bore out in my interviews and certainly in my psychological testing I did with him.
But before we go to relate it to these two individual cases, then, did you also find whether or not he had mental illness treatment in the past?
Sure. So, yeah, he did. Now, not much, but I think around age 20, Shawn had basically some pretty significant depression and was, I think, referred to Marion General Hospital. He was prescribed Zoloft antidepressant for depression, and he took the drug for a couple weeks. And he followed outpatient, I think, on a 4th Street outpatient clinic in Mansfield, and then in 2016 for depression. So some scattered points of intervention, nothing that stuck, nothing that was long-term that he certainly, needed. He also, just to summarize for sake of brevity, he has been treated for mild depression on a few occasions with antidepressant medications. And that was what he was found to, have a report. I don't believe he had to work up this intensely with different tests and whatnot, but, he had that, and I think he had, was noted to have some potential substance abuse problems.
So, do you have an opinion based on your findings of these different disorders and effects that you just described to us on how they would relate to the two deaths that we have in front of us?
Do you actually call for a legal conclusion?
I don't know if it does.
overrule it. At this time, the answer is yes or no. Whether he has an opinion or not, that doesn't call for a legal conclusion.
Yeah, I have some thoughts.
Let's, you choose one, or should I choose one?
Well, I mean, I have a page number that we can look at.
Okay.
Oops, sorry.
That would probably help the state credit.
I would look at pages, maybe start with 67. I look at, and I talked about just attachment between him and his parents, and then especially his mother. And I had talked with her. I know this is hearsay. May I continue now?
Are you using it to support your opinion?
Absolutely.
You can continue until there's an objection and I rule on the objection.
Thank you. His mother was sexually abused by her.
Objection hearsay. It's exactly the objection we raised before, Judge.
This
Counsel approach.
Okay, Dr. Fabian, with regard to the attachment disorder, do you have an opinion as to whether or not that disorder was present in the death of Elizabeth Griffin?
Yes,
And,
it was.
and what would your opinion be?
Yes, he had certainly an attachment disorder during these offenses.
What information did you use and what information did you gain in your evaluation and in your investigation, conference with other individuals, to support your determination of attachment disorder as it relates to this case?
Well, his mother told me that she thought she had her own reactive attachment disorder as a youth and never wanted to have or should never have had kids when we talked about these issues. And that she never attached to anyone. And I think that carried over certainly to how she raised him, and especially him being off and on with his father as well. So that would be in part my opinion. Now, the other part of it is just observation of him, his offenses, what he did, his inability to connect properly with other people, his rage and hate towards his mother. It certainly, in my opinion, is part of this rage and these ultimate acts towards the victims here. But his thinking gets off track with some of what he's talked about as well. And I don't know how far you want me to go into motive or his thoughts about some of these offenses.
Is your same reasoning, does the same reasoning apply in the deaths of both women?
I would say there's some interconnectedness there of being in control, which he never had with his mother, and taking control and putting them out of his misery as he's always wanted to do to his mother. There is a theme there. It's hard not to look at when you're spending time with someone like this.
So let's review then as to what diagnosis do you believe applies to Shawn Grate then?
With his offenses?
Overall.
All right, well, it's my opinion that, when Shawn was born, he was compromised in neurological brain development. Okay, I think he was hardwired differently. I don't think he was able to comprehend, understand language, his receptive language skills, again, receiving information, making meaning of it, expressing himself was good. This short bus really hurt his development, made him very, socially inadequate, awkward, rejected. Especially, this rejection carried over from this attachment. So this attachment is kind of how we develop into how we interpersonally relate to other people, especially, in adolescence and adulthood, okay, which gets into some of these personality disorders, all right? So you have in my opinion, a kind of a damaged developing brain that along this road, you're not connecting with people, and there was a detachment, lack of connection, affirmation, acceptance, love, support that was consistent by mom. More of a rejecting, cold mother, didn't really want to have kids. And again, this is going to affect different people different ways. I didn't get the chance to talk to his brother. I talked to his sister Barb, who is much healthier than Shawn. But then he gets into these special education classes, struggles with school, and was always low self-esteem, inadequate guy, which really gets into, the depressive condition. The complex trauma, in my opinion, was always there from childhood. And as an adult, he was significantly impaired. And these personality disorders, I think, are much rooted in his childhood dysfunction. And really just how this intimacy or lack thereof and emotional connection with women. And it's certainly intertwined or connected with the hatred he had toward his mother and wanting to put her out of her misery in an altruistic seeming manner of doing good, of taking his mother out to just, take her out of her misery, or these victims, okay? He didn't want to say playing God, so to speak, but it was, a very unusual thought process.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Just a moment.
Thank you. Judge, I have several questions. If you want to consider a break, we'll take it. I'll start. Good afternoon, Dr. Fabian.
Good afternoon.
My name is Mark Weaver. I'm one of the special prosecutors appointed on this case.
Hi, Mr. Weaver.
Now, if I ask you a question today that you're not able to answer the way I put it to you, would you kindly let me know, and I'll try to ask a better question?
Sure.
Thank you. Speaking of questions, did you give defense counsel a list of questions to ask you during that last examination?
I provided some questions, not all of them. We went over them, and Mr. Whitney had, gone over them with me. So he wrote them while we talked.
But you helped him with a list of questions to ask you, isn't that true?
Yeah, I typically do to help my direct.
I'm going to take something from the report, Your Honor. I'm going to simply put on the screen a screenshot from Dr. Fabian's report. We'll show you first. And I believe to your right,
So, Mr. Whitney, do you have
we're not
any-
going to publish that particular
Okay.
slide, but in a moment, we're going to publish other slides, and Mr. Whitney's aware of them.
Okay, thank you. You may continue then.
Thank you. Dr. Fabian, you're not a medical doctor.
No,
Can you prescribe medicine?
no.
You're a doctor and a lawyer?
I have a doctorate of psychology and I have a law degree.
Did you ever take the bar exam, the exam that most law students take at the end of law school?
Yeah.
Did you pass or fail?
No.
You failed?
Yeah.
So you graduated law school, but you can't practice law, is that right?
I don't want to practice law.
But you're not allowed to practice law, right? It would be illegal for you to practice law?
Yeah, I don't practice law.
Yeah, it would be unethical, actually, to practice law without a license, wouldn't it?
Sure.
Yeah, sustained. Let's move on.
It would also be unethical to practice without a psychological license, true?
Yes.
Didn't you once practice psychology without a license?
I think for a few weeks we didn't get my fee paid.
But it
But
was,
yeah, I did. Not intentionally, but I was a court psychologist and I did not get HR's fee paid to the licensing board.
the answer is yes, you did practice psychology without a
did,
license.
Yes, not intentionally. Yes.
And that wasn't that discussed on the record in a case called State versus Hale in Cuyahoga County in front of Judge Ambrose?
That's a long time ago.
Does it sound right?
I don't remember the case.
But it was discussed,
I remember a Hale name.
was it discussed in another court where someone asked you whether you had practiced psychology without a license and you agreed on the record that you had?
Yeah, I didn't pay a fee.
Now, on that case, which State versus Hale, I'm going to give everybody a copy of it so we can look at it. May I approach the witness room?
You may.
Move that, please. Judge, I have one for the bench, one for the defense counsel. Marking this for purposes of the record as SM, State Mitigation 1. Doctor, in that case of State versus Hale, which if you look on page 1, what county did that appear in?
Cuyahoga.
And on page 2, I've highlighted roughly the year to give you a sense of what year we're talking about. What year is that?
2006. 2006.
I'm looking, actually page 2, which is, it's in orange. I've highlighted the date,
2005.
2005, right. Would you turn to the 6th page in the packet I gave you, which is marked as transcript page 3900. This is part of your cross-examination by the prosecutor.
Yes.
On line 18, you were asked whether you had testified as an expert witness in a different case called State versus Biswana Halder.
Yes.
Is that what that reflects there?
Yes.
And then when you were asked whether you had testified in that case, what was your reply?
Yes.
Right. On the next page, which is marked in the top right-hand corner as transcript page 3901, would you read for the juror the question the prosecutor asked you on lines 2 through 6, please?
Isn't it accurate in the ruling, the decision on the defendant's competency to stand trial under the signature of Peggy Foley Jones, a jurist, that your work product and credibility were criticized and ultimately discounted by the jurist in the matter?
That was the question the prosecutor asked you, whether a judge had previously discounted and criticized your testimony in a case. Was that the question?
She ruled he was incompetent.
Right.
I'm sorry, competent, and I thought he was incompetent, so she didn't agree with my opinion.
The question that the prosecutor asked you is whether or not a judge had discounted your testimony, right? That's what I simply asked you what the prosecutor asked you.
Right, and I think I said, I believe she criticized me because we didn't agree, but I'm unclear as to discounting it. I mean,
she only criticized you because she disagreed with you, right?
There was one expert that said competent, two said incompetent. She disagreed with the two incompetent findings.
On that same page, line 15, the prosecutor asked you, did she criticize the thoroughness of your work product in preparation for your testimony? And you answered how on line 17?
She did.
She did. Okay. Thank you. Have you ever been told in other cases that you were not prepared well for testimony? By a judge, for example?
I can think of a case, I was a fact witness.
Only as an opinion. I'm only interested in your expert testimony for this purpose. Let me try to help. Maybe I can refresh your memory.
Maybe Hendon in a Summit County case where well, she didn't say I was unprepared. She agreed with my opinion. I remember that case.
Okay. Did you ever testify in a United States Northern District of Ohio case called Drummond versus Houck in front of Federal District Judge Sarah Loy?
That was the case I was going to mention, but I was a fact witness, not an expert in that case.
And so in that case, was that let me just give you a copy of it, which might make it easy for him. That judge had it up for you. The Northern District of Ohio, that includes Ashland County, doesn't it?
Yes.
And what I've handed you, which I'm going to mark as SM2, States Mitigation number 2, and Drummond versus Houck. Would you look on the second page of the packet that I gave you, which is actually marked as a judge's opinion page? Isn't it true that this is a memorandum of opinion from the judge that I handed you?
Yes.
Yeah. On page 2, the judge, I'm reading now from the top of the page, which I've highlighted in orange. The judge wrote, quote, while both parties conceded that Dr. Fabian did not perform well during his mitigation testimony, Dr. Fabian faulted counsel for his failures. He maintained that counsel did not provide him adequate time to prepare, unquote. Was the judge talking about you when she wrote that in her opinion?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
Opposed to Dr. Fabian and the answer to that question regarding state mitigation, Exhibit 2. Next question.
Thank you. Dr. Fabian, would you turn to the next page, which is marked page, I'm sorry, I'm going to move to the, page 88 is marked as the page of the opinion order. Do you see page 88 there?
Yeah, I do.
I marked a pertinent passage. Let's get back to this case, Dr. Fabian. You said that you charged $300 per hour. What's the bill so far?
I don't know. You may know. I'm not sure.
Roughly?
$18,000.
And how often do you testify on behalf of the prosecution in capital cases like this one?
Not often. I've got a San Antonio case I'm doing next month from the Attorney General's office. Not often. They don't call me.
And you'll testify in that case?
Yeah.
Now, you've admitted in your report that the report you provided to the court and the lawyers in this case, you called it a biased assessment, didn't you?
Yeah, mitigation by law would be, I think, inherently biased.
And you mentioned that earlier when you were questioned by Mr. Whitney. Looking at your report, Shawn Grate's not insane, right? He's not insane.
No, I did an evaluation for insanity, and I told his lawyers I did not believe he qualified for an insanity defense.
Right. So he's not insane. But you also, your report indicates that Shawn Grate's father had no history of mental illness either. Isn't that what you said in your report?
Documented that I'm aware of, I would agree, yes.
And you also determined in your report that neither his mother or father had any alcohol or drug abuse problems. Didn't you put that on page 3 and 4 of your report?
That is correct.
And that neither his mother or his father had any legal problems, page 3 and 4 of your report?
That I'm aware of,
Yeah.
yes.
And I would only ask you things you're aware of.
Sure.
And Shawn Grate also told you that his mother had a mental problem, but you never professionally evaluated his mother, did you?
I have particular insight on our 3-hour conversation where I can pick out certain symptoms of mental illness, certainly.
You didn't administer any psychological examinations to his mother when you spoke to her, did you?
No, but she's psychologically disturbed.
And you, in your report, you also found no evidence that Shawn Grate's mother ever abused him, right? On page 4, last paragraph, did you say that?
Correct. I did not testify to any abuse.
Right. Shawn Grate told you, and this is reflected in your report, that he thought his mother was at least partially to blame for the murders he committed. Didn't he tell you that?
Yeah, I believe he told the police as well, yes.
Now, Dr. Fabian, do you have any degrees in the studies of genetics?
No.
Genetics, is it fair to say, is essentially the study of hereditary attributes that are passed down from parents to children?
Correct.
And so basic genetics would say a very tall mother and a very tall father might have tall children.
That makes sense.
That's very basic, right?
Yes.
But you don't have a degree in genetics. You're not an expert in genetics.
There's not the word genetic in that report, I don't think.
Right. Well, but you have testified previously that you believe that the biology of parents makes someone more violent, essentially that children can inherit a gene for violence. You've testified that way before, haven't you?
There's certain twin studies in Australia and other countries that look at criminal genetics, and with twins reared, one with family, one without, and there is a good amount of scientific literature that supports the genetic relay of criminality and violence. But then we get into situations where siblings may not be violent and one is, and I don't come here saying I'm not adhering to that opinion in this case.
You testified that way before, that it's in the genes, that it's possible to inherit a gene to make you violent.
I said that there's a nature-nurture argument with criminality and violence with parents, certainly, yes.
And in your discussions with Shawn Grate and your review of other materials, you wrote in your report that Shawn Grate blames his mother, but he also blames the city of Ashland partially for these crimes, doesn't he?
He had a convoluted thought of welfare system, recipients, and it was, in my opinion, a very warped perception of that, but yes.
Now, as a psychologist, you spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether criminals know that they're breaking the law, whether they're aware of they're breaking the law, right?
That would be insanity, yes.
Right. And in this case, in many places in your report, you indicate signs that Shawn Grate knew what he was doing was illegal. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I don't doubt that.
That he was aware of the wrongfulness of his behavior in many different ways.
Yeah, and Ms. Mager certainly cited that in her reports, and I have some of that dittoed, so to speak.
Your report also indicates on page 43 that Shawn Grate said, quote, "I am pretty dangerous and I have to admit it." Isn't that right? That's in your report?
That is.
And your report also indicates that he gets fan mail in jail and he tracks it.
He's told me that, yes.
Yeah. And on page 39 of your report, you indicate that Shawn Grate has expressed a hope he continues to kill people when he gets to prison. Isn't that in your report? Page 39, paragraph 3.
3.
Isn't that correct?
I'm looking.
I'm sorry.
What's the first paragraph start with?
The quote was, quote, "He was looking forward to being in prison with child molesters and alluded to intending to kill them."
He may have said that. I mean, he did. I quoted it.
Right. How often have you interviewed killers who flat out announce to police or to you or to anyone that they plan to keep killing other people when they get to prison?
It's occasional. I don't believe he will, but it does happen.
You have no way of knowing, do you?
I don't know if he'll do that. No.
Now, there is a mitigating factor under Ohio law about somebody who's able to not know whether their conduct was criminal or not. That's not the one you mentioned.
Just a minute.
That's not the one you mentioned. Now, you administered several different tests to Shawn Grate, didn't you?
Yes.
Was one of them the PAI, the Personality Assessment Inventory?
Correct.
That's an important test, right?
I use it a lot.
It gives you an insight into the mind of Shawn Grate, does it?
A bit, yeah.
Mr. Whitney, I'm going to publish what you and I showed for Jeff to be published on the screen. Mr. Whitney's available. It's a screenshot of one of the tests that Dr. Fabian gave.
For the record, Mr. Whitney, any objection?
No, Judge.
It should appear in a moment on the screen to the right of you, Dr. Fabian. Is that the image from the test cover sheet?
Is it a blank screen?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was to the right of you.
I don't know that this
No worries.
monitor is turned on.
Yeah, that
Take your
is-
time. I know you have to look over your shoulder before you look back.
That's the front page.
And then I'm going to show you now what is another screenshot from that test, which indicates when you ask the person the question, that they have different possible answers that they can give. Is what's showing there what their choices are when they're asked the questions?
Yes.
Do you have that instrument with you?
No, but you may.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'll give you some questions. I actually have screenshotted them, and I've talked to Mr. Whitney about that as well. So I'm going to show you some of the questions here. Tell me if this is consistent with what your report says. For example, does that look like a screenshot from this personality assessment inventory?
Yes.
And the question is, I'll take advantage of others if they leave themselves open to it. How did Shawn, and again, these are screenshots of your report.
False.
He entered false. On question 91, he was asked in your test, I've done some things that weren't exactly legal. How did he answer that?
Slightly true.
Slightly true. Move to another, number 151. One of your questions was, I can talk my way out of just about anything. What was his response?
Slightly true.
Slightly true. Number 169, one of the responses you provided, or one of the questions you provided was, people don't understand how much I suffer. What was his response to that prompt?
Mainly true.
Mostly true?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's false, slightly true, mainly true, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. Under 258, he was asked, I have a bad temper. How did he respond to that one?
Slightly true.
Slightly true?
Yeah.
Last one, Doctor. I've never taken money or property that wasn't mine, number 291. What was his response to that one?
Slightly true.
Judge, you could take that off the...
Thank you.
I would like to highlight that I'm being unethical right now by not fully interpreting the psychological test as it should be.
I think Mr. Whitney's going to have a chance to ask you further questions,
Sure.
and if he thinks that's important, then you'll have plenty of time. We don't want you to be unethical. We want you to
Okay.
comply with all of the obligations of your profession. So you administered this test and the other test that you did because you thought it would give everybody, including this jury, a better sense of Shawn Grate and why he committed these crimes. Is that right?
That would be, I would say, accurate.
It's one of the reasons?
Yeah.
Isn't there an important diagnostic tool that psychologists use called the MMPI? Can you tell the jury what the MMPI is?
Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, second edition. It's a test assessing psychopathology, mental illness, personality, addiction.
Did you administer that in this test? In this case, did you administer that test?
No,
Why is that?
because I had administered 3 other tests and I got the information I needed. I mean, I diagnosed him with personality disorder. I thought I had his mental illness down quite well.
Now,
I gave him the Omni, personality, MCMI. Sometimes, lawyers will ask me or tell me, hey, we don't want certain tests used. That did not happen in this case. I was not instructed to not use tests, so I thought I had enough information from him.
Isn't that one of the better tools to identify whether someone has antisocial personality disorder?
Yeah, but I already said he did.
You said he did?
Yeah.
In your report?
Yeah, he has another specified personality disorder with traits of antisocial personality, borderline personality, schizotypal personality, schizoid personality, and narcissistic personality. So we covered that in my direct.
Right, but you didn't specifically diagnose him with antisocial personality disorder, did you?
I didn't see that he had a juvenile history of conduct disorder. If he did have a stronger history, then I would not have a problem at all with that diagnosis.
So the answer to my question is you did not specifically diagnose him with that, did you?
No, he certainly has enough traits of it. He was missing what I thought was conduct disorder as a juvenile. The MMPI would not have helped me formulate that opinion.
You mentioned the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Can you tell the jury what that is?
Yeah, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association. Basically, it's basically their criminal code manual of psychiatry and psychology, which explains diagnoses.
And doesn't the DSM call antisocial personality disorder, quote, a pervasive pattern of disregard for and the violation of the rights of others? Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Pretty close. And people who testify in your case or people who defend cases like this, they don't really want the jury to hear the term antisocial personality disorder, do they?
Well, let me be clear. I'm not defending Shawn Grate, but yes, and I get instructed not to use particular tests, and I use them when I think they're appropriate, and I think Shawn certainly has antisocial personality characteristics.
Didn't you actually write an article in Death Penalty Mitigation and the Role of the Forensic Psychologist in Law and Psychology Review that mentions this topic?
Yeah.
This would be in 2003.
Long time ago.
Yeah, I hear you. And in that article, didn't you suggest to whoever reads it, I'm not sure who reads this, but I read it, that you encourage people who are testifying like you not to use the terms antisocial personality disorder?
I think I was citing other literature, and I was trying to say, hey, explain the disorder rather than just labeling it. So I've tried to explain the disorder in this case.
So your exact quote was, while testifying, the expert should acknowledge the diagnosis of APD, but attempt to civilize the defendant and describe his behaviors and their causes while limiting the use of the actual words antisocial personality disorder, unquote. Why would someone want to limit the use of the actual words?
Because maybe it could be deemed prejudicial. I'm not limiting these words, and I did write that a long time ago, and I'm not running from this diagnosis.
Okay. I'm going to put I actually have a list of the diagnoses that you made in your report.
Sure.
Can you turn to that while I show this, Mr. Whitney?
Yeah.
Judge, Mr. Whitney, do you have any objection to me publishing the list of the diagnoses on the screen? Would you please put that up?
Sure. List is published without objection from defense counsel.
Can you see that, Doctor?
Yes.
I'm sorry the letters are small. Just look at for a moment. I'm representing that to you as being a list of all of the different diagnoses, but would you look at that and see if that indeed is what it is?
I would agree.
So for clarity purposes, I thought we would go through one at a time.
Sure.
And ask some questions. So let's first just look at.
I was going to say, Doctor, if it would assist you, you just need to hit the power button on that little monitor to your right
okay.
that they neglected to turn on. And
If we could keep you from having to turn around the whole time, that'd be good for everybody, right? There's not a lot of information to look at just now, just the words persistent depressive disorder. You did diagnose Shawn Grate with that, right?
Yes.
And it actually is listed in we call the DSM. It's listed as a disorder there, isn't it?
Yes.
And according to the DSM, particularly criteria E, doesn't a psychologist first have to determine that someone who has persistent depressive disorder has never had a hypomanic episode. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right.
This is a layperson's term, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Depression tends to be low, like the word depressive.
Yes.
And mania or manic tends to be high.
Yes.
Is that just rough purposes, correct?
Sure.
And so DSM says if someone's ever had a manic episode, criteria E says, then there cannot be persistent depressive disorder. Isn't that what the DSM says?
Yes.
And would you describe mania, maybe, again, I think you described it earlier, it's kind of being energetic and very up a lot, maybe the way some people are where they drink a lot of coffee?
Yes.
Is that an episode of mania? All right, so if we agree that someone who's had a hypomanic episode can't be persistent depressive disorder, didn't you say that you found some tendencies of Shawn Grate for bipolar disorder?
Yeah, may I explain?
Sure.
Okay. I once learned the first week in a court psychiatric clinic with the jail doctor that it may take him a year to definitively understand a person's diagnosis. A year, not a pre-trial evaluation or 2 or 4 that I had with him in a complex individual like him. And so I learned that it's very difficult to be exactly right. And in the courtroom, we try to be, okay? So that list of disorders, he certainly has symptoms and traits of, but I also said that ADHD and depression certainly overlap with bipolar disorder.
Are you or are you not diagnosing persistent depressive disorder as listed on your report?
I would probably say it's more of a persistent depressive disorder and an ADHD, more so than a bipolar disorder.
We'll talk about ADHD in a moment.
Sure.
But on page 75 of your report, you wrote, he also presented with evidence of bipolar disorder. We mentioned that.
Sure.
And then you went on to say, and it is likely that he experiences more hypomanic episodes.
That is, I did write that.
And so if you have
he's not had any diagnoses of hypomanic episodes in the jail. He's not been on medications. So, it is unclear.
under the book, any hypomanic episode ever in your life, and you can't be that.
Sure.
Am I correct?
Yeah, I don't have a problem.
Okay. Let's move to the next one. I'm just going to highlight the next one. Again, there's not a lot to look at other than a term, so we're being clear about what we're talking about. This one you identified as unspecific bipolar and related disorders. Now, doesn't unspecified in the title mean that you chose not to make specific findings about bipolar?
Yeah, or I can say other specified, which I did choose. I did make some comments about bipolar.
We're talking about DSM-5 296.80, right?
Yes.
Doesn't that section of, again, the handbook say that particular diagnosis is really supposed to be made based on a quick evaluation? And they give the example of a clinician seeing somebody in an ER, an emergency room, very quickly. Isn't that what that's reserved for, according to the DSM?
Yes, but I've owned the fact that I don't really have consistent evidence in prison or jail that he's had bipolar. So I am, it's more than a grain of salt, but it is unclear.
You had 4 different visits with Shawn Grate?
Yes.
Over roughly a 14-month period since they started?
Yes.
You had time to make more specific findings, didn't you?
The mood disorder questionnaire did say he had bipolar. The PAI did not. So it's very difficult.
I'm turning to the next diagnosis, Doctor. Simply going to the next one. You identified this in your report as other specified trauma and stressor-related disorder, and then you put parens complex trauma. This is DSM 30989 or 3099, is that right?
Yes, that's my putting in complex trauma. It's not in the DSM.
And in your report, you give essentially what I would call a 3-paragraph textbook definition of what that is.
Complex trauma?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But you make no specific findings about how that particular diagnosis applies to Shawn Grate. You simply conclude he has evidence of a traumatic stress condition due to complex trauma based on early neglect. Isn't that true?
Yes.
So it's called specified, that's the second word in the title, but
Yeah.
you made no specific findings. Isn't that right?
No. I have like 81 pages outlining trauma, attachment disorder, and complex trauma. So I don't agree with you on that.
Doesn't DSM 30989 and 309.9 require you to make specific, certain findings right from the DSM and put it in your diagnosis in order to say that you reach the punchline of that?
I have a lot of hours of trauma, so we're not going to agree on that.
Okay. Let's look at the next one that you, again, I'm putting these in the order that they are in your report. You called it specific learning disorder, and then you put parens language, is that right?
Yes.
This is essentially a problem that relates to classroom learning, true?
Well, it's a learning disorder.
Classroom learning. And DSM 315 is what we're talking about here?
I don't have it memorized.
That's right, I wouldn't expect you to. Requires the psychologist to review school reports before making this diagnosis. It's on page 37 of the DSM. Did you review any of Shawn Grate's school records before you made the diagnosis of specific learning disorder?
I think they were destroyed or burned.
So the answer is no.
My psychological, neuropsychological testing is indicative of a learning disorder. We're really splitting hairs.
We can live with no out. Let's move to the next diagnosis you found here, doctor. This is mild neurocognitive disorder due to traumatic brain injury. Some people call these TBIs, is that right?
Yes.
On page 24 of your report, you indicate Shawn Grate says that he slid into a bird bath and hurt his head when he was 6 years old, right?
Yes.
And you also indicated he never went to the hospital, isn't that true?
Correct.
Yeah. And then you said that when he was also 4, 5, 6, thereabout, he was playing with a hammer and he accidentally swung and hit himself in the head. You reported that too?
Yes.
Of course, he was telling you something he did at 4 years old, but you wrote it down. That's what you're supposed to do, right?
Well, I have some concerns about early concussive experiences. I also have concerns about my neuropsychological testing for concussive experiences, and I also have concerns about neuroimaging that was not allowed to be done in this case.
Oh,
So if we want to be
Your Honor, may we
really
approach?
honest
You
about
may.
this,